Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on the Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region.
Good evening to the 4 people who have joined us now. More people will be joining us a little bit later. So today the topic is the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific and the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook. And of course, once again, we've got Professor Stephen Nagy, whom you know quite well, I believe, already, not only from the series here on Clubhouse, but from many other events, which he talks about on LinkedIn and also on Twitter and other platforms, I believe. So thank you very much for tonight, Stephen. I appreciate your being here, despite your crazy schedule, and I mean crazy schedule in very good, the best sense of the word. And without any further delay, let's start. So the floor is yours. Well, as everybody knows, of course, after Stephen finishes the briefing, we're going to open the floor for comments, questions, discussion. So please join us here. Do not hesitate to do that. We'll be happy to welcome you. And so let's start.
So thanks very much, Maya, and thank you very much to everybody that's on the call tonight. It's great to always engage with people, and I encourage anybody that wants to step up to the speaker to jump in. So today's topic is looking at the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific and ASEAN, and what ASEAN means for the Indo-Pacific, both from the perspective of countries like Japan, but also for the ASEAN countries themselves. And this is a little bit different. And that's why I wanted to separate those two arguments. So let's think about ASEAN, and think about ASEAN in terms of its history and in terms of its identity. ASEAN has worked together in its current 10-country format for about 30 or 40 years, and one of the key pillars of its cooperation is something called consensus-based decision-making, or the so-called ASEAN way. And what that means is that everybody agrees on something, and that's how it gets done, through consultation, through diplomacy, and through understanding or thinking about each other's position and finding some kind of common ground. So we often talk about this in terms of low politics, and that ASEAN can achieve a lot of things in the low political area. And one of the most, I guess, best examples of that is migration between ASEAN countries. So if you're a Vietnamese, you can go to Singapore, you can go to the Philippines, you can go to Myanmar without a visa. And that's a pretty good example of the kind of cooperation that goes on through ASEAN. So that would be considered low politics. But on high politics, or the more difficult issues, such as a code of conduct in the South China Sea, or let's say a common taxation policy, or a common position on China, here ASEAN doesn't perform very well in terms of the area of high politics. Even on something like AUKUS, and I see Hiroaki is online, and he's interested in limiting the roles of intermediate missile systems and other kinds of missile systems in the region. It's very difficult for ASEAN to have a common platform on something like the AUKUS and nuclear-powered submarines operating in and around the South China Seas. And we've seen countries like the Philippines and Vietnam welcome the agreement, where other countries are very hesitant, and they discuss it in terms of nuclearizing a region that was previously not nuclearized. So the key things to understand about ASEAN is it focuses on consensus-based decision-making and the so-called ASEAN way. And this has been the platform for regional integration for the past 40 or 50 years, where countries agree that they wouldn't really move forward on any significant policy until all the countries come to consensus. Now, this has resulted in what we call a Indo-Pacific strategy, or outlook in the case of ASEAN, that re-emphasizes the role of ASEAN centrality in Asia's regional integration. What that means is that all countries agree to the process, or that any kind of change of the status quo in the region would have to come through consensus of all the stakeholders in mind. And what that means is that everybody has the same agreement and the same understanding of whatever particular issue it is. So that could be how to understand the South China Sea territorial issues, or it could be about the movement of people in Asia throughout the region, maybe visa free, or a particular position on something like the environment. So the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook really puts ASEAN front and center in terms of the Indo-Pacific's development, and it puts the ASEAN way, consensus-based decision-making, as the key framing of how countries within the Indo-Pacific region that want to work with ASEAN should be engaged in region building. Now, this means that Japan really ASEAN works with other countries to promote this kind of decision-making process, this consensus-based decision-making process, and it really tries to ensure that ASEAN remains the central connector or hub between the so-called Pacific part of the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean part of the Pacific. And there's a lot of stakeholder buy-in here, in that many countries in ASEAN don't want to choose between China and the United States. They want to maintain the consensus-based decision-making because it ensures that there's no dramatic change in the region on things like governance or human rights or security, which suits the heterogeneity of the ASEAN countries, in that amongst the ASEAN countries, there's many kinds of political systems, there's many kinds of economic systems, and there's many levels of development. And the best example, of course, is comparing Singapore versus the Philippines. One is a soft authoritarian regime, and the other is a flawed democracy that is definitely an emerging state. Now, these two comparisons are really interesting because they work together on some issues, and other issues they don't. So that is the ASEAN side of the Indo-Pacific when we're thinking about the Indo-Pacific. But when we think about Japan and how Japan is thinking about ASEAN in its own Indo-Pacific vision, it's important to understand that Japan's position continues to evolve. And what does that mean? If we were to go back to Prime Minister Abe's initial framing of the Indo-Pacific region, it looked at ASEAN as an important partner of Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy, but not the key partner. And when we look at Japan's diplomatic blue books, whether from 2017 or 18 or 19, ASEAN isn't really centrally positioned in the diplomatic blue books, although it is recognized as an important part of the Indo-Pacific region. But in the blue book of 2020 and 2021, of course, we see that the Japanese government has placed has done a tremendous job of placing ASEAN front and center of how Japan is thinking about the Indo-Pacific region. And with that, they're really focusing on the idea of ASEAN being a critical part of the Indo-Pacific, and that the ASEAN way or ASEAN centrality remains a critical part of how Japan is understanding the Indo-Pacific region. Now, when we're thinking about this further, how is Japan trying to strengthen ASEAN's position in the Indo-Pacific? Here, and we've talked about this in previous discussions, it's doing this through various kinds of activities. And one of the biggest activities is to provide a significant amount of aid to Southeast Asia. And that aid is what we call overseas direct development assistance. So helping ASEAN develop their economies and develop their societies in a way that is in line with Japanese interests, but is also synergistic with Japan's economic priorities. And that means focusing on the diversification of supply chains, focusing on the diversification of trade partners, but also helping strengthen the strategic autonomy of ASEAN by boosting the intra-ASEAN economic integration. And from Japan's perspective, the view is that the more integrated ASEAN is, the more it can function autonomously or strategically autonomously in terms of foreign policy. And that's a real critical feature of Japan's foreign policy, is to strengthen ASEAN. So in terms of Japan's view about the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN could be a much stronger and more reliable partner that can make decisions that are independent of China. And I think this is something that we underestimate in terms of thinking about ASEAN's role within the region, is that it has its biggest trading partner is China, and it needs to think about that relationship and prioritize that relationship when it's engaging in different kinds of relations. But at the same time, it wants to have that strategic independence so that it can make decisions that are better for ASEAN. So Japan's position on ASEAN is to continue trying to strengthen it internally so that its institutions are more cohesive, so it can make decisions more strategically autonomous, and that it is wedded to the shared view about the importance of a rules-based approach to international relations in the Indo-Pacific region. And that means creating new rules that are important for emerging issues within the region. And that could be things like the digital economy. It could be things like AI. It could be things like transnational disease policy. So when Japan is advocating for a rules-based region, it's not advocating for keeping the rules as they are, but adopting rules that are transparent and really focused on a transparent, rules-based approach to international relations. And that's a really, really important. And it views ASEAN as an important part of that because ASEAN is one of the hubs for Japan's manufacturing network. But it also sees the ASEAN way as a useful tool to prevent one country from dominating the region. And the ASEAN way, again, going back to this point about consensus-based decision-making, that any decision that would go on in the region couldn't be dominated by one country. It would have to come through a consensus of all the countries within the region. And by supporting this kind of initiative, really it prevents, or Japan's trying to prevent what we call a might is right approach to how the Indo-Pacific region is governed. And there's another expression for this, is that the powerful countries do what they want and weak countries do what they must to survive in this kind of system. And Japan doesn't want to be part of that system. It doesn't want ASEAN to be part of the system. They want to make sure that rules are the final arbiter of how states behave within the region. Now, Japan is working with ASEAN countries in other ways as well. We've talked about strategic partnerships before, but you've seen Prime Minister Abe visit Vietnam this week. And in that visit, he's talked about trade. He's talked about building human capacity in the Vietnamese context. He's talked about interoperability training between the two states. And he's also talked about building Vietnam's own capacities to deal with some of its maritime security challenges in the South China Sea. So how is Japan helping? Well, providing Coast Guard vessels, providing some technologies to bolster Vietnam's own maritime awareness capabilities, ships committed to visiting Cam Ranh Bay, one of the big deep water ports in Vietnam, regularly, to build a shared understanding of the region. And that's really, really important. And I see that Lynn and Stephen and Erwin and Bader and others are online that may be able to share their views on this. But Japan really wants to create strong partners in Southeast Asia so that they will look to Japan for support, for some leadership, and for cooperation on development that will help them deal with the challenges within the region. Now, other countries are also looking at ASEAN in very critical ways. The United States is looking to ASEAN to be an important part of where it invests and starts to build institutions. We see the European Union also look to ASEAN as an important area where they want to help strengthen through infrastructure and connectivity, to helping them build with resilience within the region. And we also see other countries, like my own, Canada, interested in development and something called inclusive development and dealing with climate change within ASEAN as well. And what this speaks to is that many countries understand that if they want to get stakeholder buy-in into their Indo-Pacific strategies or visions and guidelines, that it's going to be really, really critical for them to actually provide the public goods that ASEAN wants. And while ASEAN has security concerns with China, their primary concern continues to be development. In the COVID-19 pandemic era, another priority, of course, is recovering from the pandemic, to opening up their economies to tourism. And you've seen probably in the news countries like Thailand with their economy, I think it's 12 or 15, or even up to 17% of their GDP is based on tourism. So they want to open up, and they're looking for partners to help them open up their economies so that they can reap the benefits of integration and being part of a free and open world. And this is really, really important. And if countries are primarily advocating security, a hardline approach to the biggest challenge in the region, China, it's going to be increasingly difficult for them to get stakeholder buy-in. And what I mean by that is that ASEAN will just say, listen, we appreciate the ideas, we appreciate the thoughts, but ultimately we can't choose between our economic partner of China and our more comprehensive partner, whether that's Japan or the United States or others. And as a result, we're going to stick with the status quo. So we see ASEAN advocating for an Indo-Pacific vision or strategy or outlook that's focusing on development, ASEAN centrality. And we see Japan and other countries finding ways to get stakeholder buy-in by ASEAN through focusing on development, infrastructure, connectivity, human capacity building, and others. And I think that's some really, really important way for us to be thinking about how ASEAN and Japan and other countries are looking at the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific. So I think it's a great opportunity now to have others jump in here and share their views about the importance of the Indo-Pacific and how ASEAN and other countries are looking at the region.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. I hope that everybody else could hear you well during the past 2 minutes because I lost you a couple of times. Hopefully it was only me. So I invite everybody who is in the room to join us up here on stage and share your observations and comments with us because, well, we know that there are quite a few countries in the ASEAN and as Stephen mentioned, there are different political systems, different stages of development, different interests and priorities there as well. So I just wonder, Stephen, because you mentioned that Japan's approach is to strengthen ASEAN in terms of well, economic development and also economic assistance and security. And then the goal of this strengthening of the economies and security of the ASEAN countries is to actually help them become less dependent on China. So I wonder what the Chinese perspective on this is.
That's a great question, and I think when China is looking at ASEAN, they look at ASEAN a couple different ways, and I think it's useful to separate the idea of Southeast Asia and ASEAN. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is a relatively new phenomenon in terms of the region's history. And historically, China, or the dynastic Chinas, have had strong economic relations, or they have been part of China's broader sphere of influence for hundreds of years. And, you know, in some Chinese texts and in some Chinese thinking, countries like Vietnam, you know, this is not my view. I'm just echoing what I hear from Chinese colleagues, is that they see Vietnam and as part of China, or in the past part of China, and they see much of Southeast Asia as being a cultural inheritor of Chinese prosperity and culture and traditions. So China views the current approach by ASEAN both with consternation and support. They see ASEAN as striving for strategic autonomy, not necessarily bad. They see ASEAN working together, and the consensus-based decision-making is not necessarily bad, because it only allows for the lowest common denominator to be the area of consensus, and that usually means non-contentious areas for China. And we've seen that China has been able to block a code of conduct in the South China Sea. They look at ASEAN and its ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook as something that reflects Chinese interests. Here, it's not talking about security. It's not talking about rules-based order. It's not even talking about security challenges. It's basically talking about ASEAN centrality. So, from the Chinese point of view, this is good, and good. But they also view ASEAN's efforts to achieve more strategic autonomy through various kinds of relations with Japan or Australia or India or potentially the United States as a concern, because that's, according to the Chinese, ASEAN is China's backyard, and it wants to make sure that it has influence on all those governments, so that their first decision when it comes to politics refers to and thinks about China's interests before it thinks about Washington's interests. Now, the increased interest of many countries on Southeast Asia, in particular Japan, the United States, Australia, India, is also viewed through the lens of, and again, this is how the Communist Party of China thinks about these issues, that the United States and other countries are trying to create an anti-Chinese coalition or alliance that eventually will include Southeast Asia. Now, I don't think that's the case, but that is how they are interpreting the issues. And with that, they're going to China continues to put more and more economic tools into Southeast Asia and ASEAN to ensure that it remains within China's sphere of influence, and that it remains wedded to a one China policy, and it remains wedded to keeping or maintaining a non-securitized relationship with the United States.
Yes, that's interesting because well, what you just said is also, leading me to another question. So it looks like China also investing in those countries and making sure that they preserve the status quo and don't have to choose between China and the USA is also good for the countries of ASEAN. But how about military security, or security in terms of supply chains and also resources for the development of their economies? How is the status quo about there in this sense of the word?
Well, Southeast Asia is very small compared to China in terms of being important parts of the supply chains and an alternative to the Chinese-based consumer market. But it has growing importance from the Japanese standpoint. Japan has invested a huge amount of money in the region in terms of helping build infrastructure connectivity, in terms of contributing to good governance, in terms of training public servants. So I have many public servants that I train in terms of international relations and public policy. So I think that there is a real game at hand in terms of who's trying to influence ASEAN the most. And at this stage, it's complicated because China has tremendous resources, economic resources, but it doesn't have tremendous trust. And Japan and Southeast Asia, Europe has more trust, but less resources to invest in the region. And this creates challenges in terms of thinking about the direction that ASEAN is going to go moving forward. We also have to be thinking about what does ASEAN want? And ASEAN, again, is looking at all the different ways that it can build strategic autonomy, continue to grow their economy and be more stable, but also to maintain their sovereignty. And that is something I think we don't prioritize enough in our analysis and looking at Southeast Asia. Many of these countries were former colonies of Europe, and they want to be, they want their own national autonomy. They want to be sovereign, and this drives a lot of their actions within the region. And I think that is something to be thinking about. And when they're looking at China and they're looking at other countries, they look at how they can maximize their strategic autonomy and protect their sovereignty, at the same time maximize the benefits. And we call this opportunity maximization versus risk contingency, if we're using something out of international relations called hedging. And I think some of our people on our call may understand this as well. Lynn Ha is online. So Lynn, do you have a question or a comment?
Yeah. So before I share my comment from the Vietnamese perspective, I would like to ask Professor Stephen two questions. The first question is, do you think that that it make any differences when studying vision and outlook? Because it's just a matter of now's choice, but do you think that there is anything in mind for ASEAN countries to use ASEAN outlook, not ASEAN vision? And my second question is, why did Indonesia take the lead in launching the ASEAN outlook in Indo-Pacific? I mean, does Indonesia sees any more interest than other ASEAN member states that push it to take the lead in delivering this outlook?
So the first question, I think it'll depend on where you come from, but let me give you an example. The first Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific vision that came out of Japan used the word strategy, and this was seen as potentially aggressive or non-inclusive from the standpoint of China. And there was a couple of reasons for this, is that the Chinese character or the Japanese character for strategy, one of the characters has the same character as war. So I think that the Japanese thought about this, and they thought strategy would probably not be the best way to articulate its understanding of an Indo-Pacific vision. So it switched to this idea of vision. Now, ASEAN is a bit interesting case. It uses the term outlook, and I think that it reflects ASEAN's penchant for neutrality and putting ASEAN first, and trying to prioritize the ASEAN way in terms of how it thinks about its preferences. I think that ASEAN was concerned that an Indo-Pacific vision or framework or strategy or guidelines would potentially make ASEAN less relevant and less important, and cause potentially ASEAN to disintegrate. And as a result, they wanted to choose a word that would bring the region together. Now, the second part, why did Indonesia take the lead? Indonesia is the biggest country in ASEAN, but it also has a track record of neutrality. And neutrality in terms of not wanting to choose between the United States and China. And as a result, it became, kind of the critical partner that said, well, this is a better way for us to move forward. The concept of the ASEAN way and consensus-based decision-making is really critical for ASEAN's raison d'etre, or the reason for being, and that if we don't, fight and we don't create a strong vision, outlook that it comes from ASEAN, that it could potentially lead to ASEAN's fracturing. So I think Indonesia, because of size, because of its understandings of the problem of ASEAN, that it decided to promote this concept of a more an ASEAN outlook rather than a strategy or vision.
Yes, thank you. So now I would like to share some of my impression about the idea of Indo-Pacific from the perspective Vietnam, because I think that all Japanese leaders from Abe to Suga and now Kishida, when visiting Vietnam, they all mentioned the coordination between the two countries to realize the free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And from the Japanese side, I mean the Japanese social media, I can catch a lot of stories highlighting Japan-Vietnam cooperation prospects to implement this vision. However, to my personal observation from the Vietnamese side, the Indo-Pacific term in general and the idea of free and open Indo-Pacific is not significantly mentioned. Even I myself, before I come to Japan to study, I hadn't heard any much about the Quad or Indo-Pacific. So when I came to Japan, yes, I heard a lot of discussions about this topic, and I found it quite surprising and quite interesting when I read an article written by you that explained the absence of a Canadian free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And one of the surprising reasons for me is you mentioned the domestic politics that Canadian politicians have not been able to communicate the significance of the Indo-Pacific vision to the average Canadian readers. And I think that it really reminds me to the case of Vietnam. And but at a Southeast Asian country, I think that in case of Vietnam, it is quite understandable because many countries in Southeast Asia do not have quite positive views about Japan's initiatives like the Quad or FOI because of their interpretation of the initiative as anti-China. However, Canada, as an ally of the US and also other middle powers like Japan, Australia, it also have come up with their own free and open Indo-Pacific versions. But Canada seems like have no idea about that. So these realities make me really surprising. And however, in the case of Vietnam, I think that is quite understandable. However, even when ASEAN deliver its outlook on the Indo-Pacific, my impression is that it is just kind of repetitive of some ASEAN documents or joint statements regarding the resolution of regional issues like the South China Sea disputes. And this kind of joint statement, in fact, to my impression, do not work much in reality. So I mean that I don't see much possibility of ASEAN to translate the ideas that mentioned in this ASEAN outlook into reality. So it is something that I would like to hear your view about, like the prospect of ASEAN outlook, that how it will be translated into reality, and how Japan will work with ASEAN to realize this kind of initiative. Yeah, thank you.
Well, most diplomacy, Lynn, works on interaction. So ASEAN has their position, Japan and other countries have their position on many different issues. And, they push and pull each other in different directions to try and get them to get some buy-in into their particular position. So from the Japanese viewpoint, they value the idea of a free and open concept and trying to create rules as the basis for engagement. And this is really, really critical, right? They don't want to see a might is right approach to international relations like we've seen with Russia and Ukraine, where Russia has proactively tried to reshape European borders through invading Ukraine. And that is a whole discussion, but we've seen the use of military power to try and change Ukraine's decision making. Japan doesn't want this to happen in its backyard, and arguably no other country wants to happen in their backyard. So whether it's forced reunification with Taiwan or claiming all the territories in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, this would fundamentally reshape the security architecture and would make an approach or international relations be dictated by power and not by rules. And I think here Japan is not really willing to move away from that. But they've moved away from talking about the promotion of democracy and human rights. And in a sense that they want to make sure that all the other players within the Indo-Pacific are also valuing this concept of rules-based approaches to dealing with disputes or international affairs within the region. And by using that approach rather than focusing on a liberal democratic approach or a liberal international order, they're hoping to get buy-in from countries with different political systems, like your country, Vietnam, or Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and even Singapore to an extent. If there's a focus on values, in particular democracy and human rights, or authoritarianism versus democracy, Japan's not going to get any buy-in for its policies. So I think this is why Japan is choosing focusing on a rules-based approach, and that it's moved away from a primary security focus and values promotion to focusing on a rules-based approach. In the case of ASEAN, ASEAN being ASEAN, it doesn't have a rules-based approach. It has a non-binding, consensus-based decision-making approach to how it makes decisions. And some of the ASEAN countries would be very happy with rules, where others would be very unhappy with rules. And this shapes their decision-making as to how it looks at the Indo-Pacific outlook or vision, or how other countries are thinking about these issues.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you, Lynn. And Bader, do I pronounce your name correctly?
Yeah, you did. Thank you. I have a question to Professor Stephen. Hello. I wonder if I have a cutting voice or it's my connection, because I hear you not that well.
I can hear you clearly better.
Oh, great. Professor Stephen, I have a question which might be irrelevant, but I would like to have the chance to ask you this question because I'm sure we might have sort of an idea about regarding this matter, which is, I've heard that there is a Chinese military presence in the Chinese Sea, and I would love to know if why China. They do care about the dominance of this specific area, which is, I think it's where Malaysia and Singapore and Indonesia, that area on the sea. Is it a political reason, or is it something regarding the sovereignty, or anything like that? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Badr. So China's interests in the South China Sea, I think, primarily are three or fourfold. First, there's an enormous amount of resources within the South China Sea, whether it's fishery resources or energy resources, as well as the unknown resources that are yet to be identified and understood how to exploit. So I think that is the first level when we're thinking about China's interest in the South China Sea. And the South China Sea is very, very, very big. It looks small on a map, but in reality, it is very, very big. And I think that is an important part of how China is thinking about the South China Sea. Second, China is thinking about how it can secure the South China Sea and dominate the South China Sea so that it can dominate most of the Southeast Asian countries. And in China's view, by being able to dominate the South China Sea, it will be able to dominate these Southeast Asian countries so that they will, going back to my point about making decisions that are in the interest of China rather than the interest of Washington. And that is something that China continues to focus on. It wants to have a periphery, or countries that are surrounding it, that all look to Beijing for leadership and defer to Beijing's wishes in terms of how it thinks about the region. The third area that I think is important is something that we call sea lines of communication. So about $5 trillion of trade goes through the South China Sea annually. So that is basically one Japanese economy every year. So it's a lot of trade. But also energy resources are all going in and out of the South China Sea through the Taiwan Straits and the East China Sea. And this is fueling the economic growth of China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, And China understands that this, if there was ever a conflict with, let's say, the United States, that one of the, I guess, the key things that the United States would do would be to block off the sea lines of communication, so energy resources and imports and exports couldn't go in and out of the Chinese economy. And that would mean that the Chinese economy would lose its global trading status, and it would be unable to get the energy resources to fuel its incredible economic growth. So China's viewing it through at least those three perspectives, but also I think historically, and I think this is really interesting for you to be thinking about. In the past, in the Qing era, and of course the Republican era, China was invaded from the coast, was invaded from the ocean. In the 1900s, we had American ships sailing up the Yangtze River. So imagine what the Americans would think if a Chinese warship was sailing up the Mississippi. So there's a real strong historical memory that China is always been fragile at its edges, and it has been invaded in the past, not once, but not twice, but many times by its coastline, and that it needs to secure the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and Taiwan to ensure that this never happens again. So there's a lot of different ways that China is thinking about this region, but I think those four levels are really important for understanding its immediate needs. Lastly, I think China understands that dominating this whole region is the best way to achieve national security and security of the party. And that's why it invests so much time and energy and resources in terms of trying to be the regional hegemon or the dominant country within this region.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your question. I cannot see other hands up at the moment.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes, please, Lynn. Go ahead.
Professor Stephen, what does Japan expect from Vietnam and Indonesia in the free and open Indo-Pacific region? So as you explained earlier about Indonesia, I can understand that because it's also the country that took the lead in pushing the idea of Indo-Pacific vision in ASEAN. However, from Vietnam, I think that it is one of the countries that I think that's less open or publicly support Japan's vision about Indo-Pacific. However, whenever Japanese Prime Minister chose Vietnam as their first destination, they also describe Vietnam as a critical country in realizing Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision. So, I mean that what Japan expect from that? Personally, I don't think that Japan just expect that Vietnam or other ASEAN countries to openly support Japan's foray, but what concrete steps from the countries that Japan expect that they can do to help Japan realize its free and open Indo-Pacific vision?
So I think Japan's approach is actually really long-term. It wants to invest in relationships. It wants to invest in building solid partnerships. It wants to help Vietnam develop economically, to be more independent. It wants to help Vietnam deal with its problems by itself. And by doing that, I think Japan thinks that this is probably a good way to build trust, to build shared norms and shared institutions over the long term. And through building relationships over 10, 20, 30 years, that the bilateral relationship will be in a much better place, a much stronger place. And I think that approach is not just with Vietnam, but with many countries, that it's really thinking about how to build these long-term institutional relationships and economic relationships based on a commitment that is based on, I think, a sense of shared views about of development and about rules and about respecting each other's government systems. And with that, I don't see Japan trying to shape the Vietnamese political thinking, but it certainly wants to make sure that Vietnam has strong interest in Japan and strong relations with Japan at the diplomatic level and people-to-people level.
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Lynn. And I haven't seen Chao Ting for maybe 2 or 3 weeks. I guess he's quite busy too, like you, Stephen.
Yeah, he's running his Wenshen. I see Ren's online from Taiwan, or is he in the United States now?
Oh, hi. Sorry.
Oh,
It's
that's Stephen.
Thanks, Dr. Stephen, and Maya and everybody. First time to join this very interesting discussion. And so I'm myself an Australian, but based here in Bangkok, but many years in Laos and Japan. And so recently, I mean, of course, in the you would know in the Australian media and discourse recently, there's been much to do about this agreement between China and the Solomon Islands regarding various degrees of cooperation, etc. And much is being made about the Pacific islands seeing, their sort of non-traditional security needs like development and particularly climate change as, bigger priorities for them than a great power competition or China and these kind of things that are prioritized, by middle power and great powers. So I guess my question would be, to what extent is that an issue also, as you see it, in terms of ASEAN? Like, for example, in Laos, they obviously have a lot of development needs and they don't have access to the sea. So, a lot of these issues of climate change or whatever would seem more pressing, So I'm just wondering if I could get some of your views on that. Thank you very much.
So thanks, Stephen. I think so this is very true. So we have, the countries like Laos and Cambodia and Myanmar to a certain extent that have real development needs, real infrastructure connectivity needs. And, they're looking for any kind of financial aid from any country to build roads, just to build bridges, to help them develop. And China has been a really critical partner for Laos and Cambodia. But Japan has also been there too. So we see that these two states are competing for influence within Southeast Asia by building bridges and roads and ports, etc. Now, recently, China has created they're building a port in Cambodia, and that will likely be used for the Chinese Navy. And there's real concerns about, will this be a site for the projection of power by the Chinese Navy, the People's Liberation Army's Navy in Southeast Asia. And it's received a lot of pushback by the United States and other countries in a similar way to what's happened with the Solomon Islands in the Pacific. So when we're looking at the influence of outside players in ASEAN, we see this competition for economic influence, for influence in terms of development aid. During the pandemic, we saw vaccine diplomacy with China competing with the United States and European countries and Japan in terms of providing vaccines to Southeast Asia, always to get a foothold and to ingratiate themselves in the economies. This continues to be the case. Now, will China build a military base in Cambodia or elsewhere in the coming years? We don't know. My suspicion is probably not, and the reason is that I think the countries in Southeast Asia are wary of fully buying into the Chinese dream. And that means, limiting how close they get to China. Even Cambodia is now trying to, court the Japanese and the United States because they want to have strategic autonomy too. If there was a military agreement between any state and China, this would be a very significant issue. So if we saw something like we've seen with the Solomon Islands in China, I suspect that we'd see enormous pressure by ASEAN countries, the United States, Japan, and others to push back against the agreement and find some kind of alternative, because it would really reshape how ASEAN works, and it would create, it would cause the fracturing of ASEAN at a very, very deep level.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Stephen.
Appreciate it.
As well, Aren, would you like to join us? Oh,
It's
hello.
a quiet night tonight.
It is
Hello.
a quiet night, yes. Hello, Ren.
Hi,
Very
how
nice
are you?
to have you with us.
Yes, thank you. I have been back in Philadelphia, and morning time here happen to be always some work. But when I have no work, I like to jump into Steve's room. So I'm glad I have nothing to do this morning. So thank you.
Thanks for coming, Ren.
Thank you, and congratulations to your new assignment, Stephen.
More gray hairs. More gray hairs.
Okay, I missed some parts of. I just joined your room maybe 5 minutes ago, so I apologize if I'm asking something that was already discussed before. But Mr. Kishida visiting the three countries on his way to EU. I was curious about how you see how these three countries were selected. My understanding is he stopped by Indonesia because of it's part of the meeting, but then he chose Vietnam and Thailand. He didn't choose Philippines, for example. He didn't choose Malaysia or Singapore or India, but he chose Vietnam, which is a growing power in Southeast Asia, I understand. And Thailand is because of the traditional, important, the longest, I think one of the longest relation country in Southeast Asia with Japan. But is there any other reasons that we do not know that you know that you would like to share with us how he chose these three countries on the way to Europe? Thank you.
So Vietnam remains, thanks, Ren, and welcome. So Vietnam continues to remain one of the stars in ASEAN in terms of its economic growth. It's relatively pro-Japan. It's part of the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. It has strong views about South China Sea issues, and that at the same time it has strong affiliation with China. And this is actually a bit of a paradox, but it makes Vietnam a relatively reliable partner for Japan in terms of prosecuting some of its concerns in the South China Sea. Thailand, I think, is a wavering state, and that Thailand is having a sense of that it needs a bit of love. And so Japan is going to Thailand to try and strengthen that relationship, probably through investment, so that they can sway Thailand in a different direction. And there's a strong view, I think, in many capitals that Thailand is, very close to China. The princess of one of the princesses speaks Chinese, and she's the honorary president of the Thai-China relationship. So there's a strong sense that Japan needs to invest its resources into Thailand. And on the Indonesian front, it's the biggest country, right? It's the biggest country in ASEAN. It'll have 400 million people in the next 10 years, lots of resources. It's a huge country, and it represents a real opportunity for Japan if it can build those strong relationships with Indonesia and help shape Indonesia's leadership over ASEAN. So I think those three countries are prioritized for many reasons. Philippines is in election, so there's questions about whether it's good timing to visit the Philippines as it's going through an election. Myanmar is I don't think really needs explanation. Malaysia is a bit unstable and not as important as others. And Brunei, Cambodia, and Laos are less important. And Kishida visited Cambodia earlier or late last year. So I think the priority is based on those those reasons that I gave.
Thank you. And then I think, is it true? I'm speaking from my memory. Wasn't it true? Vietnam was reluctant to join others to for the lack of a better word, criticize Russia's action in UN, and that could have been another reason Mr. Kishida stopped by Vietnam to ask them to be more clear about their position towards Russian aggression these days.
So it's correct that Vietnam has not criticized Russia, and the reason is that there's long-standing relations, and the older leaders in Vietnam have very strong relations with Russia. They also see NATO expansionism as one of the reasons why Russia engaged in this war, and their military still is dependent on Russia. So I think there's lots of reasons for Vietnam's support or neutrality with regards to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Can Japan change the dial on that? If I understand Japan's thinking well enough, I don't think Japan would be so arrogant that it would say you need to change your view. I think Japan's approach would just be to demonstrate that it's a strong, reliable partner, and it will continue to invest in the relationship, and hopefully that their positions on other issues will converge.
Thank you. And finally, on this one, I found it interesting that, or maybe this happens all the time, you can please let me know if that's the case. Interesting that Mr. Kishida contributed to a major, or I guess national newspaper in Thailand about his visiting and his hope for a better or more relationship with Thailand. um, of course, with local Thai language on their newspaper when he visited Thailand. And there's a Japanese version of what he said in that news on his contribution. I found it interesting. I think he said two things. The first thing is that both Thailand and Japan have been independent countries, and we both understand how important to be regarded as an independent country, and we are standing together. Something like that. I think he said that we do not allow other countries to invade an independent country with force or change the courses with force. And the second thing is about further collaboration with Thailand. To that end, Japan is going to build some technical schools to invite young Thai technical students to come to Japan to learn more. And I thought that was pretty a very warm, heartwarming kind of message. And he also mentioned that Thailand has more Japanese companies in the country, more than any other countries in Southeast Asia. So I found Mr. Kishida's passion towards Thailand, which is a different way of, maybe different reason of visiting Vietnam, which because of the reason you mentioned. But Thailand is something that I didn't know that Mr. Kishida had so much love, if you will, or passion toward. But writing something on the local newspaper in local language, is this common or is this an exception? And how he feels about Thailand is not a surprise to you, or was a surprise to you too?
So I think writing in local newspapers has become more normal, or having high-level government officials write in local newspapers when the Prime Minister visits it. So there was an advisor to the Prime Minister that wrote in a public newspaper when Prime Minister Kishida visited Vietnam on his last visit. So I don't think this is so unusual. Now, does Kishida have a special feeling about Thailand? I don't want to say that he doesn't have a special feeling, but I don't think it's any more special than Vietnam or Indonesia. I think that there's more of the sense that Thailand is tilting towards China at a stage when Japan would prefer it not to, and as a result, it's trying to invest in the diplomatic, invest as much as possible in diplomacy to try and prevent that. It tilting too far into China's corners, and that is just the reality of diplomacy, right? The governments, want to make sure that the relationship with whatever particular country remains strong and robust, and I don't think it's reflective of Mr. Kishida finding enlightenment in Thailand on a former business trip, rather just the reality of Thailand tilting towards China, and that Japan feels it's important to put more effort into that bilateral relationship.
Oh, I see. Thank you. I didn't know that Thailand was tilting towards China. Was there some, sorry for my ignorance here, was there some recent events or ceremonial things happen between Thailand and China that you could care to share with us?
So there's been a lot, though, before the pandemic, a huge amount of Chinese tourism into China. Like I said, one of the princesses is a fluent Mandarin speaker and has very strong relations with the Chinese government, and that's facilitated a lot of different exchanges with the two countries. There's more and more developmental aid and other forms of aid going into to Thailand by China, and in general, the relationships are mostly positive compared to, let's say, Vietnam and China. So I don't think there's anything particularly special, but there's nothing extraordinarily disruptive. Thailand doesn't face the territorial issues that Vietnam and Malaysia, Philippines, and others face. The historical issues aren't there. And again, the royal family is relatively close to China, and that impacts the decision making. So in the chat box, Hiroaki, is lots of questions.
Yes,
Can you see this too?
I can see them. Yes, they are mostly comments with a couple of questions. So, shall I read the comments so that
Sure.
everybody can hear them? Okay, so I'll start with the first one. Hiroaki, thank you for giving them to us. The first one is, to be honest, I'm still thinking whether or how the ASEAN way is really working in the Indo-Pacific. if ASEAN can facilitate US-China or China-Taiwan rapprochement rather than radicalize great power competition through the ASEAN way, the Ukrainian war, that would be great. And added to this, if ASEAN can do a mediation for or facilitate an earlier ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia through the ASEAN way, it would be great too. So the next comment is about Indonesia, and Indonesia for its G20 chair role. So this is the reason for choosing the three countries, I believe, right? So Indonesia was chosen for its G20 chair role, Thailand for its APEC chair role, and perhaps Vietnam for China or the Indo-Pacific. So this is Hiroaki's comment about the reasons. And the next one is Japanese media mainly report the aim of Prime Minister Kishida's ASEAN countries is to seek their cooperation and understanding of the US and allies and Europe's effort to strengthen sanctions vis-a-vis Russia for stopping the Ukrainian war.
Yeah, so I would agree with you on all those points. I think that they're really great points that you've made, Hiroaki. Japan is trying to shape the debate, and that's going to mean visiting those countries and engaging more diplomacy with those countries. And as long as Japan remains unengaged through diplomacy at the leadership level, Japan won't be able to position itself in the same way that it would like to, in the ideal position that it would like to. So from my viewpoint, I think it's really important that it's again engaging with the partners that will be shaping the decision making this year and in the years to come.
And thanks from my side as well, Hiroaki. I think, it reminds me the reason maybe Kishida-san visited Thailand is because Thailand is the next ASEAN chair, right? Am I right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think Han is in the room.
Han, hello. Can you hear us?
Oh, yeah, hi. Okay, hi, Stephen. Hi, everybody.
Hi there.
Yeah, so don't really have any questions, so I just say that, like, for, Thailand, like, so close relationship with China is also have some kind of political reason for it, like, just starting from, I think, 2006, Thailand has been, like, under a lot of, coup d'etats by the military. And that was one of the reasons why, relationship between Thailand and the United States start to kind of like, became quite tense. The United States doesn't really want to get too close to, a military regime. So that kind of leaves Thailand without not much of a, kind of a strong ally. So at the same time, China also, like, they tend to give support for the military regime in Thailand, and and along with a lot of, like, a strong economic presence in the country. So in the last decade, I would say, like, Thailand relationship with China has become much closer, while its relationship with the United States, which is treaty ally, has become quite tense and kind of like a distant. Thank you.
I would agree with you, Han. So
Yeah.
Japan and other countries need to do a lot more work, or they might face the Solomon Islands kind of challenge in Southeast Asia. And that means working more closely with Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, having a less politicized or less value-oriented diplomacy and focusing on shared interests. And that's going to mean a lot more, time on the ground, listening to the ASEAN countries, and maybe not necessarily getting exactly what you want, but building that consensus to move forward on whatever the decision is.
If you have any words in conclusion for this room, please share them with us.
So I just want to say thank you to everybody that came up onto the stage and joined us in tonight's discussion. Maya for hosting, and I do hope for those in Japan that you have a good Golden Week. For those that are still in the time zone where there's Labor Day, I hope that you enjoyed Labor Day. And yes, I look forward to seeing some of you in person, or all of you in person, very soon.
Stephen, thank you very much for being here, for preparing for this room. Thank you, Stephen, and Han and Lynn, also Ren, who left. And thank you, everybody who stayed with us and listened to the conversation. So have a great Golden Week, or enjoy the Labor Day. And we're looking forward to have you here again on June the 6th.
Thanks, everyone. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks, Maya.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Stephen. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.